Wow. That's very impressive. You haven't even said anything yet, Vladimir. I feel like you should play the piano or something now. Well, welcome everyone, and what a warm welcome that is for our speaker. My name is Catherine Stoner. I'm the Mosbacher Director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, professor of political science by courtesy, and a senior fellow at Hoover by courtesy, all here at Stanford, of course. It's my honor to introduce our Wesson lecturer this year, Vladimir Kara-Murza, and our moderator, Michael McFall, who is the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies here. First, however, I want to just take a moment to thank the veterans who have protected freedom and democracy in the United States and beyond on this Veterans Day. Second, a little about the Wesson Lecture Series in International Relations Theory and Practice. The Wesson Lectureship was established at Stanford by the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies in 1988. It provides support for a public address at the university by a prominent scholar or practicing professional in the field of international relations. The series has been made possible by a gift from the late Robert G. Wesson, a scholar of international affairs, a prolific author, and a senior research fellow at the Hoover Institution. In establishing the series, Dr. Wesson stated his hope that the lectures would stimulate increased commitment to the study of international relations in a context that would enable students to understand the importance of developing practical policies within a theoretical and analytical framework. Previous Wesson lecturers have included such distinguished speakers as McGeorge Bundy, Willy de Klerk, Condoleezza Rice, who of course is now the director of the Hoover Institution, Mikhail Gorbachev, Fernando Enrico Cardoso, and Mary Robinson, as well as Venezuelan opposition leader Leopoldo Lopez. Today, to this distinguished list of Wesson lecturers, we add Vladimir Kara-Murza. Vladimir is a Russian politician, author, historian, and a former political prisoner until August of this year. He is currently a vice president of the Free Russia Foundation. Mr. Kara-Murza was a close colleague of the slain opposition leader Boris Nemtsov. He's also served as deputy leader of the People's Freedom Party and was a candidate for the Russian parliament. He led diplomatic efforts on behalf of the opposition and has played a key role in the adoption of the Magnitsky sanctions against top Russian officials by the United States, United Kingdom, European Union, Canada, and Australia. For this work, he was twice poisoned and left in a coma. A joint media investigation by Bellingcat, The Insider, and Der Spiegel has identified FSB officers behind the attacks. In April 2022, Mr. Kara-Murza was arrested in Moscow for his public denunciation of the invasion of Ukraine and of the war crimes committed by Russian forces. Following a closed-door trial at the Moscow City Court, he was sentenced to 25 years for so-called high treason, which is the longest sentence of any political prisoner in Russian or Soviet history. For much of this, he was kept in solitary confinement at a maximum security prison in Omsk in Siberia. He was released in August of 2024 as part of the largest East-West prisoner exchange since the Cold War, which was negotiated by the United States and the German governments. Kara-Murza is a contributing writer at the Washington Post, and incredibly, he won a Pulitzer while he was in prison in 2024 for the columns that he has written from prison, and has previously worked also for Echo of Moscow, the BBC, RTV, Kommersant, and other media organizations. He's directed 3 documentary films, is the author or contributor of several books on Russian history and politics, and as I mentioned, is currently the vice president of the Free Russia Foundation. He's also a senior advisor at Human Rights First, and was a senior fellow at the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. Vladimir Kara-Murza was the founding chairman of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation, which is led by our mutual friend, Zhana Nemtsova, his daughter. And he has led successful international efforts to commemorate Boris Nemtsov, including street designations in Washington, D.C. and London. Vladimir has been profiled on CBS 60 Minutes and NBC Nightly News and has appeared on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and BBC Newsnight. Vladimir has received several awards, including the Sakharov Prize for Journalism as an Act of Conscience, the Magnitsky Human Rights Award, and the Geneva Summit Courage Award, as well as the Council of Europe's Václav Havel Human Rights Prize. He's an honorary fellow at Trinity Hall, Cambridge University, and we are very, very pleased to welcome him back to Stanford. Vladimir will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes when I'm finished here, and then we'll have questions moderated by my friend and colleague, Michael McFaul. Mike, as many of you will know, or as many of you know him as Mike, I suppose, is the director, as I mentioned, of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He's also the Ken Olivier and Angela Nomolini Professor of International Studies and in the Department of Political Science, and the Peter and Helen Bing Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He joined the Stanford faculty, I want to say, as a child in 1995.
Yes, as a child, yes. Wonder kid.
And I joined after that. And he's an international affairs analyst for NBC News, as well as a columnist for the Washington Post. He served for 5 years in the Obama administration, first as special assistant to the president and senior director for Russian and Eurasian affairs at the National Security Council at the White House from 2009 to 12, and then as the United States ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014. So with that, please join me in welcoming Vladimir Kara-Murza to Stanford and thanking Ambassador McFaul for moderating the discussion that will follow.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you. Thank you so much, Catherine, for this very kind introduction. I'm afraid my piano playing skills aren't what they used to be, and they didn't used to be too good in the first place. I used to play clarinet almost professionally. That was my alternative vocation in life, and my wife always says, had I chosen that instead of politics, life would have been much quieter and calmer, but here we are. I want to thank the Freeman Spogli Institute for this very kind invitation. I want to thank my friend, Ambassador Professor Mike McFaul, for the opportunity to meet and speak with all of you today. I'm very, very happy to be back here at Stanford, and I really mean it when I say it. It's now been 3 months since the prisoner exchange, but I have to say that to me, one of the most difficult things in prison was constant isolation, constant solitary confinement, when you are just completely deprived of any kind of human contact. And now it's now been a bit over 3 months from the exchange. I still cherish every minute I actually spend speaking with real people. So I'm very much looking forward to our conversation and our discussion that Ambassador McFaul will moderate in a few minutes. Our meeting is taking place around 2 important anniversaries. One a very happy one, and the other one not so much. This past weekend, we marked the 35th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, November 9th, a historic event that spurned a myriad of anti-communist uprising across Central and Eastern Europe, culminating, of course, in Russia's own democratic revolution in August of 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet regime. Next month, we will be marking 25 years, a quarter of a century, since Vladimir Putin came to power in Russia and began to transform the imperfect democracy that we had back in the 1990s to the perfect dictatorship that we live in today. Just 8 short years between what was the highest hope for freedom in the modern history of Russia and the arrival of a former KGB officer, although they themselves like to say that there's no such thing as a former KGB officer, to the Kremlin. And the whole world today is living with the consequences. This development was not inevitable. Indeed, it was not even likely. Certainly didn't seem likely in the early 90s. And the question of what went wrong in the 1990s in Russia, why our democratic transition was botched, holds to my mind much more than historical or academic interest. Because there will be another window of opportunity for change in Russia, and we do not have a right to repeat those same mistakes. And for that, we need to know them, and we need to learn from them. There's a maxim that has been proven across different eras, different continents, different historical circumstances by countries that have successfully transitioned from dictatorship to democracy. If you do not want the past evil to return, it must be publicly reckoned with, it must be publicly accounted for, and it must be publicly condemned. In the different ways and formats, this process that lawyers sometimes refer to as transitional justice was followed by many countries that sought to reckon with and overcome the trauma of past totalitarian rule. From South Africa after apartheid to Argentina after its military dictatorship, from Czechoslovakia and Poland and other countries of the former Warsaw Pact after the collapse of communism, to, of course, Germany after 1945, and then again in the eastern parts after 1989. These processes work differently in every case, according to concrete circumstances, according to national traditions, but the key, the essential elements in all of these cases were the same: transparency and accountability. Archives were opened. The crimes committed by former regimes were made public. The institutions responsible for these crimes were fully dismantled. The people who had committed these crimes were held accountable, either through judicial tribunals or Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, or at the very least, through the procedure of lustrations that barred operatives of former regimes and collaborators of their security services from ever holding positions of power in these new democracies, a necessary self-defense mechanism. These processes were not without critics. They did not always go smoothly in every case, but they worked. And whatever the flaws and imperfections of these democratic systems, that necessary stage of public reckoning ruled out any return to the past. This was possible in Russia in the early 1990s too. The window of opportunity was short, as it always is in revolutionary times, perhaps a year or two at best, but it was there. And there were people at the time who understood the importance of seizing that window. The first among them was Vladimir Bukovsky, a legendary Soviet dissident and author who spent nearly 12 years in the Gulag and was expelled from the USSR in a prisoner exchange in December of 1976. I may add, also an alumnus of this university. Intelligent, principled, charismatic, Bukovsky could have been Russia's answer to Václav Havel. In 1991, he returned to Russia and worked tirelessly to try to convince President Yeltsin and his close circle to open the Soviet archives, to conduct a public trial of the former regime. Not of the people, that was important. The goal was not to imprison anyone. As Bukovsky said, the goal was not to create a gulag in reverse, but a trial of the crimes of the past system, to open society's eyes to all the evils that had been committed on its behalf and in its name during the decades of communist rule. In what seemed to be the first step on this road, in 1992, during the hearings at the Constitutional Court in the Russian Federation, in the case of the Communist Party versus President Yeltsin, Bukovsky, who served as an expert for the presidential side during that legal proceeding, received partial access to the former archive of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on Staraya Ploshchad, on Staraya Square, vaults housing thousands of documents detailing decisions made by Soviet leaders, Politburo members, behind closed doors. That same year, in 1992, Galina Starovoytova, a very prominent lawmaker, one of the leading figures in the Russian democratic movement, member of parliament from St. Petersburg, introduced a draft law on lustrations into the Russian parliament. This bill repeated many of the same proposals that had already been implemented by then in Czechoslovakia. And what it proposed to do was to impose a ban on holding public office for any former senior officials of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union or officers of the Soviet KGB. Had this law been adopted, the likes of Vladimir Putin would never have been able to come anywhere near positions of power. And another document of historic significance was the dissenting opinion published by Judge Anatoly Kononov of the Russian Constitutional Court in November of 1992, following the hearings which I referenced on the Communist Party versus President Yeltsin case at the Constitutional Court of the Russian Federation, decrying the court's toothless final ruling on that case. Judge Kononov argued for judging the actions of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union under the existing international statutes relating to genocide, war crimes, crimes of aggression, and crimes against humanity. In effect, arguing for creating a legal basis for a Nuremberg-style trial of the crimes committed by the communist regime. Again, importantly, this was not something argued in hindsight. This legal opinion was published in November of 1992. That same year, a poll by FTSIOM, the All-Russian Public Opinion Research Center, showed that more than 50% of Russian citizens approved of the idea of barring former communists from positions of power. It was painfully close, but it never happened. Starovoytova's lustrations bill was never considered in Parliament. Judge Kononov's legal opinion fell on his colleagues' deaf ears. After a brief window, the Soviet archives were resealed again, and Bukovsky managed to convince almost everyone in President Yeltsin's close circle of the need for this trial of the former regime, but not the president himself. The inertia of post-Soviet bureaucracy proved stronger than the urgency to turn the page on the totalitarian past. Be careful, it's like dealing with a wounded beast, Bukovsky warned Yeltsin's ministers before leaving Moscow again in 1993. If you don't finish it off, it will attack you, end of quote. As we know, of course, this is exactly what happened. Because when evil is not publicly reckoned with, publicly accounted for, and publicly condemned, it will return. On December the 20th, 1999, 11 days before he would succeed President Boris Yeltsin in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin, then still Prime Minister of Russia, came to Lubyanka Square, the site of the old KGB, now FSB headquarters, to officially unveil a memorial plaque to Yuri Andropov. That was someone who epitomized the worst of the Soviet system, both in terms of the domestic repression and the external aggression. Andropov, as ambassador, Soviet ambassador to Budapest, had been one of the masterminds of the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956. And as longtime chairman of the Soviet KGB, he prioritized the targeting of domestic political dissent, set up a special operations service within the KGB called the Fifth Chief Directorate, specifically tasked with suppressing domestic political dissent, and expanded the horrific practice of punitive psychiatry when dissidents were declared mentally insane and kept in torturous conditions in psychiatric institutions. Again, a man who symbolized the worst of the Soviet system. And Vladimir Putin chose as one of his first actions to open a memorial plaque to him. Now, Russia is a country of symbols, and Putin could not have chosen a more potent one to signal the direction of his future rule. And just in case anyone still had any questions, in the very first year of his presidency, Putin reinstated the Stalin-era Soviet national anthem as the national anthem of the Russian Federation. And it was not too long before symbols would be followed by actions. This was the first mistake of the 1990s, one the responsibility for which rests with a Russian government unwilling or unable to fully come to terms with the Soviet past. But there was another mistake, this time committed by Western democracies that were also unable or unwilling to fully embrace and welcome that nascent democratic Russia into its ranks, unable or unwilling to fully integrate it into Euro-Atlantic institutions. Because it was that prospect of Euro-Atlantic integration, that promise of a return to the family of civilized nations, that light at the end of the tunnel, that served as the most powerful incentive for successful democratic and market reforms in so many countries of the former Warsaw Pact. In his address to the joint session of the United States Congress in February of 1990, Václav Havel termed the whole process of post-communist transformation in his homeland of Czechoslovakia as, I quote, returning to Europe, end of quote. Acceding to NATO, the European community, meant so much more for these countries than security guarantees or economic benefits. It was first and foremost the reaffirmation of their full-fledged citizenship in a civilized world. Russia never received that promise in the 1990s. Indeed, it was rebuffed with deafening silence when it made the first step. On December the 20th, 1991, during the North Atlantic Cooperation Council meeting in Brussels, Ambassador Nikolai Afanasievsky delivered a letter to NATO Secretary General Manfred Wörner from Russian President Boris Yeltsin that for the first time, officially and publicly, raised the question of future Russian membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That letter never even received a reply. A few years ago, I was writing an article for a Polish magazine on this subject, on NATO expansion. And I went to the archives, to the Library of Congress in Washington, to look through the documents, the publications, the press clippings from the time, to see how it was possible that a letter from the president of Russia of this magnitude, of this importance, was not even responded to. And what all the contemporary accounts come down to in the end was, and I'm going to quote directly from a New York Times piece from the time, NATO officials, from Secretary General Wörner on down, seemed too taken aback by the Russian letter to give any coherent response. End of quote. They were too taken aback to offer a coherent response. They were shocked by the very idea. This thought had never been on anybody's mind. In his recently published memoir, Firebird, which I would recommend to anybody who's interested in the politics and modern history of Russia, the former Russian Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyrev recalls that he finally received a conditional yes from the US administration on potential NATO membership for Russia by 1995, 4 years. At a time of revolutionary changes, this is an eternity. By then, the window of opportunity had long closed. And as for the benefits of what I would call first track or first tier European integration, free trade, common markets, visa-free travel, that were made available to other former Warsaw Pact countries, these were never offered to Yeltsin's Russia, even as a distant possibility. This hesitancy on the part of the West left many Russians feeling that they were being kept at the doorstep. It deprived reformers in the Russian government of a powerful argument to persevere with the necessary but unpopular reform measures, and was later, and in fact is to this day, very skillfully played by Putin's propaganda in its efforts to turn Russia away from the West. Now, I'm a historian by background and by education, so I love talking about history, but this is not why I wanted to discuss this topic today. This is about the future, because there will be another chance for change in Russia. And judging from our past, it will come just as suddenly, swiftly, and unexpectedly as it did every time before. Both the Tsarist regime at the beginning of the 20th century and the communist regime at the end of the 20th century went down in 3 days, very literally, not a figure of speech, and no one saw it coming. This is likely the way it will be next time, and we must not repeat past mistakes. There will have to be a full and public reckoning by Russian society with all the crimes committed by Putin's regime. Needless to say, all the war crimes that are being committed in Ukraine, war crimes committed by Putin's regime against other countries, in Georgia, in Syria, the many crimes committed by this regime against Russian citizens, like the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, the assassination of Alexei Navalny, the persecution of hundreds upon hundreds of political prisoners. There will need to be a full accountability for people who are responsible for these crimes. Next time, this evil really must be condemned so that it never returns again, and so that the next generation would not have to deal with another Putin a few years down the line. But just as importantly, there will have to be a roadmap from the international community on how to assist the post-Putin Russia in its democratic transition and how to reintegrate it into the international rules-based order. Because only a Russia that is peaceful, successful, and democratic will never again be a threat, either to its own people or to neighboring nations. Because only a Russia that will respect the rights and freedoms of its own citizens will also abide by the civilized norms of international behavior. And because the only way to achieve lasting security, stability, and peace on the European continent, the only way Europe can ever become whole, free, and at peace with itself, lies through a democratic Russia. This is a goal that we should have in mind. And with determination and common efforts, I have no doubt that we can make it a reality. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
So, Volodya, that was great. Thank you. Much bigger talk than I was expecting. I have really trivial, small questions, mostly about you. So I'm going to ask a few questions, but we have a big audience here. I'm going to ask maybe 4 questions, and if you answer them quickly, maybe 5, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience, right? So I'm going to get to your themes in a minute, but I want to talk a little bit about 2 questions about you first. One question I've wanted to ask you privately, and I forgot to ask you on our walk. So I'm going to ask you now in front of hundreds of people.
Thank you, Mike.
Why did you go back?
Because I believe that a politician has to be in his or her own country. I did not feel that I would have any moral right to call on my fellow Russian citizens to stand up and resist a Putin dictatorship if I did not do it myself. What would, all my words and all my calls be worth in that case? I believe those of us who are politicians, those of us who are the public faces of the opposition, have a responsibility that frankly transcends any considerations of personal safety or personal comfort. And so there was never even any question in my mind, to be honest. I mean, after both poisonings, as soon as I underwent medical rehabilitation abroad, it was here in the US both times, I went back as soon as I was able to. And I did not even think about leaving after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine because Putin, throughout the years, has been in power. He's ruled by fear. And this is especially true since February of 2022, with all these horrendous laws criminalizing any kind of anti-war speech, and with political prisoners serving longer sentences than rapists and murderers and drug traffickers. And with the record number of political prisoners we have in Russia, right? We have more political prisoners in Russia today than there were in the whole of the Soviet Union, so that's 15 countries put together in the mid-1980s toward its later period. And in this atmosphere, when the regime wants to instill fear in everyone, well, frankly, I think it is incumbent on politicians and opposition leaders to show that we should not be afraid. To me, one of the key lessons from the Soviet dissident movement, which, as you know, Mike, I've studied extensively and had the honor to know many of these people personally, a key lesson from them was that at the end of the day, fear is a choice. Because yes, the state, the regime wants to make people afraid, but at the end of the day, it's up to each of us as individuals to choose to be afraid or choose not to be afraid. I'll never forget when in 2007, there was this, you may recall, a sort of brief episode in the history of the Russian opposition where an initiative group of Russian opposition leaders came together and nominated Vladimir Bukovsky as president. This was a purely symbolic move. Everybody realized that he's never going to be allowed on the ballot, and of course he wasn't. But that was almost besides the point, right? The point was to show this is our symbolic answer to another successor from Lubyanka, right? So Russia's Václav Havel. And we had a big rally for Bukovsky on Triumphальная Square, the former Mayakovsky Square, where the dissident movement was born in the 1960s. And after that rally, a woman came up to Bukovsky and asked him, why did you choose to return? And he'd been living in England for a long time. Why did you choose to return to Russia? Do you really believe you can change something here? And he looked at her and said, no, of course I don't. And I'll never forget what he said next. He said, but I came back because people are beginning to be afraid again. And when people are beginning to be afraid, you have to come and stand next to them and say, here I am. I am not afraid. I think that's the responsibility of those people who are political leaders, and so there was no question in my mind that I would leave.
Wow. By the way, I knew Bukovsky, just so people know. I was an undergraduate here when he was working in a lab that a friend of mine worked in. And he said, Mike, you have to meet this really crazy Russian and who had really strong convictions. And you described him well today. You didn't describe his crazier sides. He was very emotional. He's a big, big figure sitting over at Treseder. The first time I met him, I was like, wow, this is a historic figure.
And his papers, by the way, are here at the Hoover Institution.
Yes. So another question about you, and then we'll pivot to more political things and open it up. I think I told you this when I saw you in Prague a few weeks ago, but the the day that Putin killed Navalny, I was in Munich Security Conference. I was with his wife. She came here later. Yulia came here, and Dasha went to school here, as you know. I want to tell you honestly, Volodya, I thought I would never see you again. That was a moment where I had always assumed that you and your other folks that were in jail at the time, and thank you to remind that there's still a lot of people still in jail, and there's still Ukrainians still in jail held by the Russians. We're going to get to them in a minute. But I would always thought that, you know, especially with Navalny, like I was joking, I was in contact with him from time to time when he was in jail. And then it got cut off. But at one point, you know, as you know, remember, he would always be so funny and he's joking. He's like, Mike, привет, hello. There's only two people in the world that read your tweets on paper, me and Putin. And I just read your latest tweet, and I had some response. But I always thought, for some reason, that he would survive Putin, right? And that I had no faith that you would get out of jail before he was there. And then that day, honestly, I lost all faith. How did it feel to you at that moment? And I do think it's a miracle that you're here. You know, I'm a person of faith. I also know, and I want you to comment on it. Let's just do this in one question. I'm taking too much time. How did you feel that day? And then now that you've known, it was a miracle, but it was a miracle that humans that really believed in you and to make this happen. But tell us first how you felt at that moment. And now, then when you, you know, when you first thought that you might be here with us today, I mean, how did your thinking about your own life change?
So Navalny was killed on the 16th of February. It was a Friday. And Omsk is 3 hours ahead of Moscow, so way ahead of Munich, where you were, right? So this was already the evening. Oh, is this working? Okay, let me put it a bit higher. This was in the evening, and when I was in prison, there was always a radio that was switched on in the prison cell.
One channel?
Yeah, of course, it's a state radio, needless to say. Yeah, I got no choice over it. I couldn't put the sound down, I couldn't switch it off, I couldn't do anything. It was there from 5 o'clock in the morning with a wake-up call, the national anthem would come in, then they would have this radio on the whole day, and then only with the lights out at 9 p.m., they would switch it off. And usually, like in normal life, I can't work, I can't read or write when there's some external sound, but there you have no choice. So I trained myself to ignore it, so making it sort of just a background noise that I wouldn't pay attention to. And that's how I got used to treating that radio. But suddenly I was having my evening meal, and in Omsk everything is like literally by the minute. They're really crazy, really fanatical about the procedures and discipline and all the rest of it. So I was eating the evening meal, and suddenly through this blah, blah, blah external noise on the radio, I heard the name of Alexei Navalny. And needless to say, in all the time I'd been in prison, either before or after, I never heard that name. Because of course, Russian state media do not say the names of opposition leaders, right? But here I heard the name, and I, just finished whatever I was doing, jumped up to the door to listen to this, and then there were some just completely surreal and crazy words that, he lost consciousness after returning from his walk, and the death occurred on such and such time. And this was it. I don't think I'm going to be able to find words in any of the languages that I know to describe the feeling. This was, as I said, a Friday evening, and on Saturday and Sunday, the weekends are the worst time in prison because there are no letters, there are no lawyers' visits, there's nothing. You just sit in the four walls and without anything. And I was, of course, glued to that radio for the next 2 days, but there was nothing. So they just said it once, and then
That was it.
back to some third-rate, unimportant news, as if nothing happened. And I have to tell you, Mike, by the end of the weekend, so by Sunday evening, I had almost convinced myself that I imagined this, that this wasn't true. Because when you sit month after month in solitary confinement, your mind does start playing tricks on you, right? It's really difficult to, there's a reason why, according to UN rules, solitary confinement for more than 15 days is considered a form of torture.
Right.
Because, we human beings are social animals, as Aristotle said, right? We need contact, interaction with each other just as much as we need water to drink or oxygen to breathe. And when you're just totally deprived of that, you start going crazy in literal sense. I was in solitary confinement for 11 straight months. And so I almost convinced myself by the end of the weekend that this never happened. I just made it up. And then came Monday, and my lawyer came on his weekly visit. And he said to me that unfortunately, I had not imagined it. I just want to say that, in the 3 months since the exchange, I've been in many countries meeting with heads of state and government and parliamentarians and various people. And sometimes from time to time I hear in these countries, on both sides of the Atlantic, I hear calls to go back to business as usual with Putin, to cut some sort of a deal with Putin, to normalize relations with Putin. I just hope the people who say this realize that they are calling for normalizing relations with a murderer. Because the regime we have in Russia today is not just a corrupt regime, it's not just an authoritarian regime, it's not just a repressive regime. It is actually a regime of murderers, led by a murderer, in the literal sense of this word. Not only somebody who's responsible for thousands and thousands of deaths of civilians in Ukraine, and in all the other wars he had conducted over the 25 years, Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, of course the original war in Ukraine back in 2014, but also someone who gives specific orders to personally assassinate his political opponents, like Boris Nemtsov in 2015, or Alexei Navalny this year. I was absolutely convinced that I was going to die in that Siberian prison.
You did.
I was absolutely convinced of this. I am, like you, a person of faith, and so yes, I also consider what happened on August 1st as a miracle, in the literal sense of this word. Just like surviving 2 poisoning attempts, those were miracles too. So I don't only believe, I have proof. But I also agree with you fully that this miracle was in many ways done through the hands of so many good people in democratic countries. First and foremost, my wife Evgenia, who was an amazing campaigner for all these 2.5 years. And so many good people in free countries on both sides of the Atlantic who never stopped advocating, speaking, shouting about this crisis with political repression in Russia and political imprisonment in Russia. And this miracle happened because of all of you. And to me, the most powerful message sent by Western governments, there's been a lot of talk in the media that this prisoner exchange was historic because it was the largest East-West prisoner swap since the Cold War, and it was. But what made it really historic to me, and what to me was the most powerful message sent by the American and the German governments in this exchange, was to insist that it included not only their own citizens held hostage by the Putin regime, those exchanges happen from time to time, but that it included Russian political prisoners. They didn't have to advocate for us. I mean, states have an obligation to advocate for their own citizens, but not for us. But they did. And to me, this was such a powerful statement because, well, first of all, it sent an amazingly strong signal of solidarity to all those people in Russia who are against this regime and who are against the war. And also, it made it clear that the free world understands that the real criminals are those people in the Kremlin who've started the war in Ukraine, not those of us who are in prison because we had opposed it. And this was the first international prisoner exchange that released Russian political prisoners since 1986, in nearly 4 decades. The last 2 exchanges were in February of 1986. It was Anatoly Sharansky, Natan Sharansky, remember famously crossed the bridge between East and West Berlin. And in October of 1986, it was Yuri Orlov, a very prominent physicist, founding chairman of the Moscow-Helsinki Group. This was before the Reykjavik summit. And President Reagan said that he won't go to Reykjavik to meet Gorbachev unless the Soviet authorities release Yuri Orlov. And there was an exchange for a couple of Soviet spies caught in New York.
Right.
There was exchange in the New York JFK airport. This was the last time. There hasn't been one in 38 years. And that's something else I've been discussing with all these leaders I've been meeting, that we cannot allow this exchange to become an exception. We cannot afford to wait another 3 or 4 decades because many of these political prisoners do not have any time. For so many who are held back there, it's literally a question of life or death, as it was for many of us. And while the 16 of us have been saved from that hell, more than 1,300 remain, and that's only according to publicly available figures. The actual numbers are much higher. And it is an urgent crisis, and it is a fundamental premise of international law that human rights violations do not constitute, quote-unquote, internal affairs. It's the fundamental principle, for example, of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, of which both Russia and the United States are founding members. And so, to my mind, the free world has not only the right, but an obligation to act, to intervene. And this is going to be my priority for the foreseeable future.
So let me ask 2 more questions and then go to the audience. With respect to that, those left behind, you talk about them frequently, Russians, and I want you to talk more about them in a minute. By the way, an American who I know personally, his name is Mark Fogel. He was the high school history teacher for my son at the Anglo-American school. He is wrongly detained too, and he is not in good health, just to remind everybody that there are still Americans there.
He was in the same cell where I was just before me. I didn't see him, but this was cell number 500 in the Vodnik prison number 5 in Moscow. When I was taken to the cell, I took his spot, his bed. He had been transferred to another, because that's the prison where they hold political prisoners, but also foreigners. And so Mark Fogel, the English teacher, I believe he is, from the Anglo-American school in Moscow. History teacher. From the
You would
Anglo-American
like that, because you,
right.
yes.
So we never met, but we were sort of neighbors, you know, in the same cell.
But there are also Ukrainians held by this regime. And I want to tell you honestly, the day you were released, you know, I'm on TV, and by the way, you have lots of friends at MSNBC. You know, they were part of that chorus. They never forgot. They love you.
That was my last interview before my arrest.
Yes.
On Ali Valshi on April 10th.
Yes.
And I was arrested on April 11th.
And I saw you the first time you interviewed with him subsequently. But Joy Reid and Rachel Maddow, I mean, so it was a joyous day in my world. I was on TV talking about it. But it was not a joyous day for the Fogel family, obviously. But I also got a lot of messages from Ukrainians. And there were two messages, and I want you to respond to them. In fact, they responded today on Twitter when I said I was hosting you today. There are 2 things. One, why were there no Ukrainians in this swap? I think that's a more rhetorical question, but it was, where are we in this story? And then there's a second piece, which is more, I want you to address this, right? I talk to Ukrainians all the time. I talked to 5 of them today in downtown Kyiv. And there is a skepticism about your optimism about Russia, right? They don't believe what you just said, that there's going to be another window. They've lost too many people. And over time, there's been a hardening, I can tell you. These are people I've known for as long as I've known you. We've known each other a long time. Some of my Ukrainian friends, there's a hardening that they don't believe Russian opposition, there's no Russian opposition. Russians, they're all evil. This is all a facade, McFaul. Why do you even give them the stage at Stanford? Literally, somebody tweeted that to me today, a Ukrainian. How do you respond to that? And is there something? Well, just how do you respond to that? I'll follow up if there's another question.
I'll start with the first one. So there are thousands of both prisoners of war, but also civilian hostages who are Ukrainian citizens sitting in Russian prisons.
Right.
The latter category is unheard of in international law. So prisoners of war are regulated by the Geneva Conventions. Civilian hostages are not supposed to be there in any military conflict, but there are thousands of them. Ukrainians were my neighbors in Omsk. So I was sitting in Krytka, which is the
Also,
most...
I didn't know that.
Yes, I was sitting in Krytka, which is the most kind of isolated section of the internal prison within the penal colony. I was sitting in solitary confinement, and so were they. These were people from the combatants from the Azov regiment, and also a very senior intelligence officer from Ukraine. Well, I'm not going to mention his name because I'm hoping one day to see him in one of these exchange lists, so I don't want to spoil anything. So they were my neighbors, and there are many of them in Russia. By the way, what the Putin regime does to deny access to the Red Cross, the International Committee of the Red Cross, because by international law, the Red Cross has to have access to prisoners of war. But the Russian government doesn't hold them as prisoners of war. They convict them under regular articles of the domestic Russian criminal code. And so that way, they don't need to give the Red Cross access.
I did not know that.
And this is why they were in the same prison as me, as opposed to in POW camps, right?
Right.
And there are thousands of people like this. And I'm not going to theorize or philosophize. I'll just give a couple of facts. First, I'm vice president of the Free Russia Foundation, which is a group coordinating, representing civil society and pro-democracy forces in Russia. The Free Russia Foundation is intricately involved in finding those Ukrainian POWs and civilian hostages in Russian prisons, because the first hurdle is to actually find these people. Nobody knows where they are.
Right.
And the only way to find them is with Russian lawyers on the ground in Russia. No one else has access. And so the Free Russia Foundation has found, I'm not allowed to say the numbers because the Ukrainians are asking us not to say the numbers of the total number of people who were exchanged. And there are, by the way, regular exchanges. To your question about why weren't Ukrainians on this exchange, there are regular exchanges of Ukrainian for Russian POWs. Those happen every month or so.
Right.
And I have the numbers in my head, but I'm not going to say them because the Ukrainian government is asking that we don't. But I can tell you that a significant share of the Ukrainian POWs that have been exchanged and that have returned to Ukraine from Russia have been located and then helped to be exchanged with the help of the Free Russia Foundation. So deeds are more important than words. I've always believed this. So this is what we do concretely. And secondly, I really want to sing the praise of Russian lawyers, who are really the unsung heroes in this, because it's amazing how much these people are risking by helping Ukrainian POWs, locating them, providing them contact with families, providing them with just basic necessities, food and all the stuff you can hand over to prison, the packages and so on. This can only be done on the ground in Russia by Russian lawyers. I also want to really name their names, but they have asked me not to because that could endanger their work if I say it out publicly. But there are committed and passionate people today in Russia on the ground, without whom many of these Ukrainian prisoners of war would not be alive today and certainly would not be home. And I think this is a good transition to the argument that all Russians are evil, because that is obviously a flat-out lie. And, in these past 3 months, I have been catching up on sort of 2.5 years' worth of information vacuum in prison. And one of the narratives that I've come across, it's not a dominant one by any means, but it is there, especially in some European Union countries, that, all these Russians, they're all imperialists, they're all authoritarians, that's in their genes, that's in their DNA. First, I didn't believe it when I heard it. I had to reread some of those things that people said. And, I would never imagine that in a 21st century, public political discourse would include something about a nation's genes or a nation's DNA. Really? Is that the level of conversation today? 4 decades ago, more than 4 decades ago, President Reagan, in his famous Westminster address in 1982, responded to this so-called argument, because it was advanced for years, right, that there are some countries that are just not made for democracy, right? They just don't have that gene in them, to use the same language. And President Reagan responded to that by saying that it is cultural condescension or worse to suggest that there's a single nation on the face of this earth that would prefer dictatorship to democracy. This was said in 1982. I think these were the best words that were ever said on this subject. It's so bizarre to me that this even has to be argued against. This argument that, all Russians are evil. Well, I guess I'll have to, say that every country has different people. Every society is made up of different people. And there are good and bad people in every country. And yes, if you're asking me, are there Russians who support Putin in his war? Yes, of course there are, and I'm ashamed of that. But are there also people who are against the Putin regime and who are against the war? Yes, and very many of them. And not everybody is prepared to go out and say so publicly like we are, because, they see what happens to us, and that's intentional. Absolutely. Our sentences are intentionally so absurd. 25 years in my case, right? My indictment and then sentence included 5 public speeches. 2 against the war in Ukraine, 2 against political repression and political assassinations in Russia, and 1 against the illegality of Putin overturning the constitutional term limits to stay in power indefinitely. When I got my sentence last April, when I was taken down into the this underground area of the Moscow City Court, where they have the spaces, the cells for prisoners, the head of the police convoy on the way down the staircase was walking in handcuffs like this and all these people around me. And he turned to me and said, "Did you really just get 25 years for 5 public speeches?" I said, "Yeah, I guess I did." He looked at me and he said, "Well, I hope they were good." And I said, "Well, if it's that sentences like this, yeah, I guess they probably weren't too bad." But this is intentional. They do this intentionally because the signal is, if you if you say what these people are saying, this is going to happen to you.
Right.
Just forget about even public speeches. About 4 or 5 weeks ago, about a month ago, a man in Moscow named Yuri Kakhovets received 5 years in prison for responding to an opinion poll question saying that he's against the war in Ukraine. 5 years in prison for answer to an opinion poll. And then I hear Western experts saying, wow, but opinion polls show high support for Putin. Really? We're going to trust opinion polls in a repressive dictatorship? Russian Field, which is an independent polling organization, you know this.
I know him, yeah.
They say that the average response rate in Russia is 5 to 7%. More than 90% of people are afraid to respond to opinion poll questions. And so, if you were to ask me about, the state of public opinion in Russia, right, as it relates to the war, that's a really popular question. It is impossible, in my view, to judge the true state of public opinion in a country that imprisons you for expressing it, right? But we do get what I call glimpses of how many people inside of Russia today feel about Putin and about his war. And one such glimpse came in February of this year, when we had our so-called presidential election on March 17th. Putin and a couple of pre-approved clowns running alongside him on the ballot. But then there was one guy, one candidate, a lawyer and former member of parliament named Boris Nadezhdin, who said that he'll be running for president of Russia as an anti-war candidate. He was using really careful language. He didn't use the language that we used, because otherwise he would have ended up where we were. But the message was clear, that he was against this war. He considered it a fatal mistake, and he promised he would end it on day one. And the public response was unimaginable. All the letters, almost all the letters I was getting in prison in February, were about these massive long lines of people that suddenly appeared everywhere across Russia, in large cities and small towns alike, of people who were waiting to sign the nomination petitions to get that guy on the ballot. Because to get on the ballot, you need a certain number of signatures. And it was so important for people to see this, because, you can rig opinion poll results, you can rig election figures, but you cannot rig the image of thousands of people standing in long lines in a February cold, I would add, in Russia. And by the way, when I say sign the nominating petition, it's not just sign, a signature. You have to leave your passport number, your home address, right, all your contact details, and people were prepared to do this. This would all go to the government, obviously. And all the letters I was getting were about this. And I'll never forget this letter one young woman wrote to me from Novorossiysk, which is a town in the south of Russia on the Black Sea coast. And she described how she waited for 2 or 3 hours in a line of like-minded people, mostly young people, to sign, Nadezhdin's ballot petition. And then she finished the letter by saying, I never realized how many of us there are. And this was so important for people to see this. And so, when I now go and meet with people in Western countries, I always ask them not to take the lying facade of Putin's propaganda for reality. There are millions of people inside of Russia who are against this war, who are against this regime. Yes, not many people are willing to go to prison for expressing those views. I think that would be true of any society.
Yes.
And why should Russia be treated differently? But there are many people who are allies of the free world in this, who are inside of Russia. And I think I understand the emotions. Believe me, I do. That's why I spoke out against this war and went to prison. I understand the emotions of Ukrainians. But we cannot base long-term strategy on emotion. There is a reason why the initial Morgenthau plan with relation to post-war Germany that was published in 1943, which was about, it was based on emotion, which was about dismembering Germany, deindustrializing Germany, basically destroying its economy, making sure that, it's completely down on its knees. There's a reason why the Morgenthau Plan was replaced by the Marshall Plan, which was the exact opposite, which was to help rebuild and reconstruct the economy and the democracy. Because Western allies at the time realized that the only way to have lasting peace, stability, and security in the western part of Europe was with a strong, successful, and democratic and peaceful Germany, not with a humiliated and dismembered one, because they've tried that after the First World War with the Treaty of Versailles. How did that one work out? And so the same logic, in my view, has to be applied now to the whole of Europe, because there's not going to be a strategic solution to this without a Russian component. And I'm fundamentally convinced that the only way we will ever have lasting peace, stability, and security on the European continent is with a democratic, successful, and peaceful Russia. That is the goal, and that's the goal we should be working towards. I'm firmly convinced of this.
Well, I still have 17 questions. Can I keep asking them? No? Okay. All right. Let's open it up to others. And I'm looking for my microphones. So I have one here. So let's go down here first, and then here, and then there.
Hi, Vladimir. My name is Nina. I'm from Kazakhstan. Thank you very much for being here. My question is, looking at the ongoing divisions within the Russian opposition right now, namely Khodorkovsky's camp and the FBK, what do you intend to do to consolidate the opposition in its current state?
Thank you so much for the question, and I can give you one very specific example without the blah, blah, blah. So this coming Sunday, November 17th, Yulia Navalnaya, Ilya Yashin, and I will be leading an anti-war march, a march against the war in Ukraine, a march to call on Putin to be brought before an international tribunal, and a march to call for the liberation of all Russian political prisoners. In Berlin, this was a march for the Russian exile community. And the purpose of this is to basically do what our compatriots back home are not able to do, to speak out for all those millions of Russians who are against this war but cannot speak out because they live in a repressive totalitarian dictatorship. So those of us who are now able to speak out will do this. And, you know, Yulia, Ilya, and I, we come from different organizations. We may not agree on some things, but frankly, that's all unimportant now. What's important is to defeat this common enemy who's sitting in the Kremlin and who's killing people every single day. And this is one specific example. I can give you several others where people are coming together. I mean, a very prominent one, of course, are these regular campaigns in support of political prisoners, the marathons that do fundraising for political prisoners, the letter-writing campaigns for political prisoners. All the different groups from the opposition take part in that. But sort of outside of the specific examples, I've always been of the opinion, I've been in Russian politics for 25 years. I came to work with Boris Nemtsov in November of 1999, actually 25 years ago this month. And I've always believed that it's completely senseless and frankly idiotic to be engaging in sort of internal squabbles and internal arguments when we have a common enemy in the Kremlin. And whatever differences we have among ourselves can be discussed in a future democratically elected Russian parliament. But first we need to have one. I've always believed that even before prison, but having gone through this experience, I can tell you that, you know, prison really does set your priorities right. And you really start understanding what is important and what's just not important at all. And all these bickerings and all these squabbles, they're just completely unimportant. And we've mentioned a few times today Vladimir Bukovsky. He wrote after his liberation from prison in an exchange in 1976, he was speaking about Soviet dissidents who, like him, experienced, you know, the Gulag, the prisons. And he said, whatever differences we may have among ourselves, no one will ever again be able to divide us into different political camps, like the left-wing camp or the right-wing camp, because we all came from the same concentration camp. So whatever differences we may have among ourselves, that's just completely unimportant compared to this shared experience that we have. And there's always that special prison bond that I think that is going to stay there forever. Thank you for the question.
Great. Well, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much.
I saw you second. Just here. Go ahead. Go ahead. Ask your question, Bogdan.
My name is Bogdan. I'm Ukrainian. I have two questions. First is very short, so just more like yes or no. Russians are committing war crimes and terrorizing Ukraine every single day, every single night. They send in thousands of drones and missiles over the last couple of months. Do you think, you're talking a lot about defeating Putin. Do you think it would be a very quick way to defeat Putin and his regime and Russians who committing war crimes in Ukraine and terrorizing Ukraine by designating Russia as a terrorist state? That's the first quick question. It's more like yes or no.
That's a pretty big question, but okay.
And the second one, as you're referring to accountability and switching the regime in Russia and defeating Putin as your prime goal to so-called Russian opposition, Ukrainian armed forces currently freed over 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory from Putin regime. Do you feel the responsibility as the Russian opposition to go and work with people in Kursk region, with Russians who are freed from Putin, freed from his regime, and are ready for you to go there and build free democratic Russia that you're talking about? Thank you.
You know what? I'll answer your second question first. Democracy is not brought by bayonets of a foreign army. So that's a very simple question to answer. I believe that Ukraine should regain all of its internationally recognized legal territory, 1991 borders, Crimea, and the 4 so-called new regions that Putin annexed in 2022. I don't believe other countries should be occupying our territory. I believe in international law, and that works both ways. To give your country back its territory, but not for anybody else to take ours. And on your first question, I certainly believe that the Putin regime is a terrorist regime, should be designated as such. Not a whole country, though. I've always made, and this is a point of principle, as Mike knows well, for many of us in the Russian democratic movement, we do not equate the regime with a country. So if you're asking whether the Putin regime should be designated as a terrorist, absolutely yes, because it is.
Great. So I see lots of hands for my microphone, folks. Can you push up for right here, and then next question over here, and then the third one right here, okay?
Yeah, can I start? I'm really glad to see you free and alive here among us. And this is kind of the question that you touched before when Nina asked question. When you say that among Russian opposition we have a lot of disagreement, right? And but when it comes to the point where some people have been, I would say, the money was taken from people, and then the organization that claims that it's really anti-corruption foundation tries to clean the reputation of people who stole this money. And you still, when this disagreement is happening, there is no word from you. There is no opinion on you on this. And I know in this world, everyone has an opinion and everyone has a word to say, right? And when you're keeping silent, it means that you're kind of lying to people that you don't have an opinion on this. But this is where you should say, do you think FBK really helps these people who stole money from normal Russians, and FBK cleared their reputation? And what do you think about Maxim Katz?
You preempted my question. I was going to ask if you work for Maxim Katz, but you asked it first.
That was a long question. Can I just ask, I should have said this at the beginning. Can you please introduce yourself before the question? And by the way, for those that want to give speeches, we have a special open mic event here that'll start at 5:45, and you can do that.
So first of all, I think it's a big problem that in this age, everybody has an opinion on everything, because everybody's not an expert on everything, and I certainly don't consider myself to be one. I think people should concentrate on areas where they're competent. That's the first thing. And the second thing I would echo what I responded to your question, that there are things that are important and there are things that just aren't. And all these bickerings and arguments and squabbles, frankly, I think it's unethical and immoral to be wasting time and energy and effort to talk about something like this when there are thousands of people that are being killed by Putin's bombs in Ukraine every day, when there are more than 1,300 political prisoners sitting in Russia. And for many of them, like Alexei Gorinov and Maria Ponomarenko, it's a question of life or death every day. And people are going to talk about some internet squabbles, some Twitter arguments. I do not have any intention of engaging in this nonsense.
Okay. Yep. Here, and then this, Debbie, right here in the middle will be the next. Go ahead, please introduce yourself.
Sure, Sheila Zellinger. My question goes back to your comments about NATO. And the question is, Ukraine a couple of months ago requested joining NATO. Should they be accepted? What are the implications of that? And how would you convince the Western countries to agree to that?
Thank you so much for the question. Well, first I'll say, as I sort of referenced in my remarks, I very much hope to see one day all of European countries, including Ukraine, including Russia, being inside of NATO, because that's the only way that we can make Europe whole, free, and at peace. And I firmly believe that they will come. On Ukraine's membership now, the argument that's usually put forward against is that a country that has territorial disputes is not allowed into NATO. That argument is false, because there are countries in NATO now that have territorial disputes with each other, like Turkey and Greece, or Great Britain and Spain. Right, Turkey and Greece over the Aegean Islands, and Britain and Spain over Gibraltar. Doesn't stop them from being in NATO, but perhaps even a more poignant example would be West Germany, Because when West Germany was admitted into NATO in 1949, its constitution stated that it includes the whole of Germany, including the GDR, which of course in reality they didn't, right? That was the GDR, Soviet controlled. And yet they still were members of NATO for 40 years until reunification, and that didn't stop it. So that's a fallacious argument. And I do believe that every country has a sovereign right to decide its own foreign and security policy. And if it is a democratically expressed will of the Ukrainian nation to join NATO, I see absolutely no reason why they should be denied that.
Me too, by the way. I'm with that. Please.
Hello, my name is Maria Denisenko, and I'm a high school student, originally from Russia. Just hearing more about how corrupt the regime I'm from is makes me urgently want to take action. So what ways, if any, big or small, would you advise the new generation to be able to take this action?
In what way? Which action?
For a more like peaceful Russia.
Well, there are many things that could be said about this. I think first and foremost, and this is especially true for those Russians like yourself who are outside of the country, it's really important to talk to people, to friends, to families, to relatives who are inside. And speaking in particular about the Russian journalists who are in exile now, to all the major independent media organizations, Meduza, TV Rain, what's left of Echo Moskvy, Novaya Gazeta, part of it at least, are outside. And so to me, one of the most important things is to help reach people inside of Russia with information. Because as astonishing as this may sound to citizens of free countries in the 21st century, a large part of the Russian population is not even aware of the horrors that are being committed in Ukraine. You know, when I was first in that cell that I mentioned, where Mark Fogel was before me, this was a cell of 6 people in Moscow, in Vodnik prison number 5. When I was brought in there, so the other 5 thought of the war in Ukraine, what they were told to think of the war in Ukraine by the television screen that was operating in the cell. After about 3 or 4 weeks, when it was me speaking to them, explaining, giving them the facts, after about 3 or 4 weeks, all 6 of us thought what I think of it. Not because I said anything brilliant or genius, I didn't, just because I gave people the facts. And you know, Russian people are no better and no worse than the other people. They're normal people. They would prefer peace to war. They'll be horrified at the thought of civilians being killed in hospitals and schools being bombed. Many people just don't know about this because it's not what Putin's television is telling them. And to me, one of the most important factors in the collapse of the communist regime in 1991 was the fact that it had become delegitimized in the eyes of its own people, or a large part of its own people, by the radio broadcasts, by Radio Liberty and the BBC and Deutsche Welle and the Voice of America and all these radio stations that for years and years had beamed the shortwave radio transmission signals across the Iron Curtain to reach millions of viewers inside the Soviet Union. And I've seen the declassified studies, the KGB internal studies that were published in the 90s, showing that up to 15%, 1/5, of the adult population of the Soviet Union were regularly listening to these broadcasts. And in large cities, this was double the proportion. And it was those teenagers who listened to Radio Liberty in late 70s, early 80s, there were the 35-year-olds who went out to the streets in August 1991 and stood against the tanks. To me, there's a direct correlation. And so I believe it is very important to help in any way we can. Obviously, journalists in a professional way, governments that have the resources to do that, this should be a priority. But regular citizens, what you're asking about, I think it's important just on a daily level to speak, to communicate, to explain, to be patient sometimes, because when people have been exposed to years and years of propaganda, it's difficult to speak to them. Believe me, I know that. So I think that is a very important task, to help people find out the truth, frankly. And I'll also mention one very specific and practical thing. It may seem like a small thing, but trust me, it's really important. When I was sitting in that solitary confinement cell in Siberia, one of the things that helped me survive and stay sane, in the literal sense of this term, was the letters that I was receiving from all over Russia and from all over the world. Because the one difference, everything else is the same, but the one difference between the time of the Soviet dissidents and our current time is that now at least there's a possibility to write to prisoners. It wasn't the case in Bukovsky's and Sharansky's time. And of course, these letters go through the prison censorship system. Very often they don't get through. Very often they get through with blacked out lines and so on. But nevertheless, many do get through. And I have to tell you, this was, to me, this was the difference between surviving or not, between staying sane or not. I think only somebody who's been in this situation can appreciate how much warmth and light and hope there can be in that sheet of paper that the prison guard hands you through the feeding slot in your cell door. And so, even though that may seem like a small thing, please write to political prisoners. There are human rights groups like Memorial and OVD Info that publish lists of political prisoners with the addresses, and it's not only the physical mailing addresses. There's an electronic system that people can fill in, including OVD Info has an English language website where you can write in English, and then their volunteers will translate it into Russian, because all the letters that go through the system have to be in Russian, and they would still get it to the prisoner. I was getting letters like this from all over the world, including from the United States. And it is really, really important. This is something that anyone can do. Just take 40 minutes or an hour out of the busy daily schedule to write to political prisoners. This means the world of a difference.
That's a great tip. Thank you. So way in the back, okay. We don't want to discriminate against the backbenchers.
Thank you. And it's so surreal to see you. Vladimir Kara-Murza, I've followed your work for a long time, and thank you so much for speaking. My name is Vineta Ivanova-Barzakov. For the last 2.5 years, I've been working on I'm a screenplay writer and an actress, and I've been working on a major motion picture about Zhana Nemtsova, and you're a primary supporting character, and I have been having such a hard time about cracking the third act. How do I want a positive, hopeful resolution to the end of the movie. And so my question to you is, do you have any ideas? What do you think it will take for the people to peacefully revolt and turn on Putin? What will it take for the Siloviki to turn on Putin? Last Wednesday, we had the devastating, shocking news of more than half of the American voters voting for a Putin wannabe. And so that makes me think, wow, how can this happen in Russia? Anyways, I hope you understand my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. Well, I'm a historian by education, and the one thing that the modern history of Russia, the last couple of centuries, teaches us is that every time changes come, they're totally unpredictable, and nobody ever sees how exactly it's going to be done. Evgeny Roizman, who's the last democratically elected mayor of Yekaterinburg, who's also a historian, good friend of mine, he likes to say that, when he gets that question, he likes to say that I can draw up 100 scenarios for you, and it's going to be 101st, because nobody's ever been able to guess it. As you can imagine from my biography, I'm not a big fan of Vladimir Lenin, and I don't often quote his speeches, but there's one speech of his that I do like, which is a speech he gave in Zurich to the youth wing of the Swiss Social Democratic Party, which he ended by saying that we old folks will not live to see the decisive battles of this coming revolution. He gave that speech at the end of January of 1917. Wow. 6 weeks later, the Tsar abdicated and the revolution began. This is just a small illustration. We have many examples like this. So no one will ever believe, and somebody tells you otherwise, do not believe them. No one will ever be able to tell you exactly how or when this is going to happen, but we do know that it will, because history has its laws. It's a science, just as chemistry and physics, except those sciences are more about numbers and equations, and ours is about the laws and the models of development, and we know what they are. There will be another window of opportunity for change, and it will come suddenly, it will come unexpectedly, and that's why I'm spending so much time now on these efforts to try to prepare for a transition, for a roadmap for that transition, for the day after Putin, because we cannot afford to be caught by surprise when that day comes.
Great. So here, and then next, I saw you right in front, Debbie, right after that. Yeah.
My name is Roman Anin. I'm the founder of an investigative media outlet called iStories. As many people here...
When did you get here?
Recently.
Okay. He used to be a fellow here. This is the first time I've seen him. Привет.
Привет. I, as probably many people here, have family members in Russia and many friends. And every time when I talk to them, I hear the same question. The question is, what can we do? And people have been addressing this question to the Russian opposition abroad. And people have been waiting for a concrete plan. And unfortunately, in these 3 years, people haven't received an answer. And this question has transformed into a statement from what can we do into we can't do anything. And you've mentioned a couple of times this window of opportunity. And my question is, what is your plan to open this window? And what can you say to people inside the country? What can they do to make this plan work? Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the question. No, that's an important one. I mentioned that my last interview before the arrest was with MSNBC. I was at my home in Moscow on video. And Ali Velshi was, I think, actually in Lviv in Ukraine.
He was.
And this is, that's how we connected. Then I was arrested the next day in the parking lot of my apartment building. And I remember the last message I gave on that interview. And that's the message I'm repeating again since my liberation. Vladimir Putin must not be allowed to emerge triumphant from this war in Ukraine. Not only because it's an unjust and criminal war, which goes without saying, but also because if he's allowed to win this one, it will mean that, a year or 18 months down the line, there'll be something else. There'll be another aggression. There'll be another invasion. Because this man has been in power for 25 years. We know who he is and what he does. He's not going to change. He's not going to stop unless he's stopped. And so, however this is going to end, if there's some sort of a settlement, some sort of an agreement, it has to be done on Ukraine's terms, not on Putin's terms. He must not be seen to be dictating an ultimatum, because if he is, that's going to be a disaster for everybody, including Russia. Because to your question about windows of opportunity, again, as a historian, I prefer to go by, by facts and by what we know, as opposed to just sort of theoretical deliberations. And what we do know, again, if we look at the last couple of centuries of Russian history, is that the biggest trigger for political change at home, for political democratization at home, is a failed war of aggression. The Crimean War in the mid-19th century, that was a complete disaster for the Tsarist regime, was followed by the greatest period of liberal reforms in the history of Russia, the great reforms under Alexander II, with the abolition of serfdom, 4 years before the abolition of slavery in this country, with the introduction of trial by jury, autonomy for universities, elected local self-government, and so on. The failed Russo-Japanese War in 1904-1905, which again ended up as a disaster for the Tsarist regime, led to a constitutional monarchy in Russia and the introduction of a parliament, of the freedom of political parties, the freedom of the press. This was the longest sustained period of political freedom in the modern history of Russia, from 1905 to 1917. And then, of course, something in my own lifetime, the humiliation for the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, when a great power could do nothing, with a country that was thought of as far away and backwards. And of course, writ large, the defeat of the communist system in the Cold War, those sort of came together. That was a major factor for the perestroika and glasnost of democratization that began in the late 80s. And so, again, this was a message I said in that last interview before my arrest. I'm saying it again today. Vladimir Putin cannot be allowed to emerge triumphant from this war in Ukraine.
Okay, so I blew it. I did not manage time as well because I was listening to you. I was not looking at my watch. We have 3 minutes left, but we started 5 minutes late. Here's my deal. We're going to go for 8 more minutes, but we're not going to go for 10. For those of you who need to get other places. And therefore, we're going to do a speed round, okay? Because I've neglected some people who have been trying to get questions in. So to the questioners, please ask one quick question. Take some notes. We're going to ask 5 or 6 questions, and then you get to talk until we get to the end. And if you don't get to all the questions, answer them, that's just fine. And you can pick and choose which ones you want to answer at this point. So please, right here, and then these 3 people, and I don't see anybody. Okay. Oh, my goodness. All right. Go quickly. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Please.
Hello, Vladimir. My name is Maria Malinovskaya. I'm a Russian poet and a Stanford PhD student in Slavic languages and literatures. And first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for your courage, for your integrity, for standing up for ordinary Russian people in this situation of hate from everywhere and for making this distinction between Russian government, Russian regime, and ordinary people. And thank you for saying that it is an ambivalent concept of collective guilt and collective responsibility. It is very important to hear, especially when you are not anymore like me inside the country. And thank you for having this role for someone who can unite people who feel a little bit, or not a little bit, isolated and alone here. And my question is about well, as a poet, and being a part of a professional poetry community, I very frequently hear from the best, from the most progressive part of it, from the most humanistic part, that the best things that Russian poets and Russian writers can do right now is just to go silent, not to talk about this oppression inside the country, not to talk about the political prisoners, not to talk about how we Russians feel right now, because there are more important issues, because the voice should be entirely given to the Ukrainian poets. And I wanted to ask about your opinion. What do you think about this? What to do? What is best to do?
We got it. We got it. Right here. We're just running out of time. we got to have really short questions, or we don't. No, we'll have no answers.
I'm going to keep it short. Good evening, Vladimir. Good evening, Michael. My name is Ella. I moved here 2 years ago after the war started. So to keep it short, who might emerge as the opposition leader here in the United States? Since you mentioned the anti-war march in Berlin, it seems that most of the opposition leaders right now are in Europe. Thank you.
Great question. Harvard man? At Stanford University. It's kind of strange, but okay.
I'm Kevin. I'm a freshman at Stanford. I just haven't done my laundry, so this is all I have.
Okay. All right.
My question is, in the United States, many Americans and politicians are increasingly disinterested in supporting Ukraine. I know Professor McFall has written about the importance of Ukraine aid. So what would you say to those Americans and politicians who no longer want to support Ukraine?
Great. And then behind you, there were 2 questions, and I think this will probably be it. I think I got everybody almost. Maybe this might be the last one, but please, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sonia. I'm from Moscow. Mark Fogel taught at my high school, so I hope he gets released soon. My question is about Putin's succession plan, and specifically, do you think that Putin's death would be the catalyst for change, or does he have a plan in place to install someone into power that may be just as evil or worse for Russia?
Okay, this person's been very patient. So last one here. I see you in the back. All right, Melissa, this person way in the back, we can't discriminate against the backbenchers. 2 quick ones, and then you'll have 35 seconds to answer all these questions.
My name is Bryce Lyford. I'm an undergraduate at UC Davis. I have a question. For the next time that we have a space in Russian history where we can bring about change, what should current and future leaders in the West do to go and make the most of that time and make sure that there is change in Russia? Thank you.
Okay, very last question in the very, very back.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a Stanford student. I come from a family of Washington Post journalists. We're all very happy to see you free and alive, as well as Jason Roseanne, and grateful to FSI for hosting him the other week as well. My question is not related to journalism. I just wanted to know, in your view, where does sexuality fit into all of this and the rhetoric of the Putin regime?
What is what? Sexuality. Oh. Is that what you said?
Sexuality and the attitudes of the Putin regime towards sexual deviance, transgender identity, and all queer identity.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left.
Okay,
so
thanks, Mike.
Do your best.
Okay.
Great questions, though. All great questions.
Right. So I'll try to do this as quickly as possible to just sort of address all of them. On this last question, I think this is all, frankly, a facade that the regime uses when it's sort of tries to portray itself as a defender of traditional Christian values, family values. Well, first of all, because a lot of it is hypocritical. Talking about sexuality, and a lot of people who work in the Kremlin, that well, let's say they're different from what they're trying to push. Everybody knows this. So the hypocrisy is glaring. But also, most importantly, it is just completely untrue. And when I sometimes hear, people who are on the right-wing spectrum in Western countries fall for this narrative, that Putin is a defender of traditional Christian and family values, I would just say, well, don't go further than look at the way the regime is treating political prisoners. I'm a Christian, I'm a family man, I have a wife and 3 children. I was not allowed to call them on the phone. I spoke, in the 2.5 years I've been in prison, I once spoke on the phone to my wife and twice with my kids. The last time was in December, just before Christmas. It was one 15-minute call. We have 3 children, so my wife was standing there with the phone, physically taking it away from a child after 5 minutes, just to make sure that nobody gets more than 5 minutes. This is how they defend Christian family values. And I was not allowed to go to church. Even though there was a church in a prison in Omsk, I could see it every day when I was being taken to my walk. I'm a practicing Russian Orthodox Christian. They did not let me go to church because I'm a political prisoner in solitary confinement. That was not allowed. And so every time you hear anything like this is complete garbage, just like everything else comes out of Putin propaganda. On the collective guilt, thank you so much for making that point. And I think, frankly, the best response to this notion of collective guilt came from Hannah Arendt, who wrote extensively on Nazi Germany. She put it in the way that collective guilt is actually a very convenient way for those who are really guilty to escape responsibility. Because as Hannah Arendt said it, if everybody's guilty, then no one really is. And I think this notion takes attention away from those who really are guilty and who really are responsible. There are many of them. And we should be focusing on them instead of blaming an entire nation by its genes or by its DNA or whatever the current discourse goes. On the poets, I don't think, on the question of the poets, I don't think there's any contradiction between one and the other. So staying silent over repression in Russia because there are horrendous crimes in Ukraine. In fact, those things are 2 sides of the same coin. If we look at the modern history of Russia, domestic repression enables and leads to external aggression. And in fact, for years and years, Putin has been engaging in repression domestically before he went out with aggression first with Georgia in 2008. And so I don't see any contradiction. I should people of letters, people of arts, people of literature should be talking about everything, and the crimes in Ukraine, the horrendous war crimes, and the horrendous repression that's being enacted on the people of Russia. I don't see any conflict there at all. Who might emerge as the opposition leader? First of all, I actually agree, Mike, when you use the term so-called opposition. I agree with this because, to me, opposition is a term that belongs to democratic societies, because members of the opposition, they sit in parliaments, they debate in television studios, they take part in elections. Those people who are political opponents of the Putin regime in our country are either dead, imprisoned, or in exile. So I don't think the term opposition is even appropriate for this. Boris Nemtsov said this towards the end, before he was murdered, that he said once to a journalist who called him an opposition leader, he said, "Don't call me an opposition leader, I'm a dissident, I'm not an opposition leader," for this very reason. And so I think the only way to determine the opposition leaders, or any political leaders in Russia, will be when we hold a free and fair election to probably a constituent assembly, because the whole state will need to be reconstituted. What started happening in 1917 but never ended. So that's the only answer I think we can give. Nobody can self-appoint themselves. I can't say I'm the opposition leader or somebody else. This would have no value whatsoever. The only way we can determine political leaders is the same way you determine it in this country or any other democracy on the face of this earth, with free elections once we have them in Russia. Yes, very important question. What do I say to those Western politicians who do not want to support Ukraine? Well, very simple. Those people who say, okay, let's stop supporting Ukraine and make peace, right, by forcing them to some sort of a deal with Putin. I say you're not making peace, you're just pushing the problem down the line and making it worse. Because if Putin is allowed to swallow Ukraine, he's not going to stop. There's going to be something else, and then something else, and something else. As I already said, he's not going to stop until he's stopped. He should have been stopped a long time ago, but at least he has to be stopped now. Yes, a question about whether Putin's death would be a catalyst for change, and whether something that comes, or someone who comes after him would be worse. First of all, yeah, I got this question a couple of times when I was in Europe too. And I know you're asking it for academic purposes, but there were people who actually, like in France, I remember somebody asking me this sincerely, like somebody who comes after Putin, could he be worse? And I said, what can be worse than a deranged madman with a nuclear bomb who is killing thousands of people every day, who's murdering his political opponents, who's imprisoning thousands of political prisoners, in the context, obviously, of the 21st century that we're living, what can be worse than that? That's actually one of the most popular tricks of the Putin propaganda, right? To say that, yeah, we're bad, but something, we may be even worse when we're gone, right? That's complete nonsense. But most importantly, though, to the premise of your question, whether Putin's death can be a catalyst for change, I very much hope that he does not die in office. In fact, I wish him good health and long years, because I want to see his face when he sits in the dock on trial. And I know that many people will want to see his face when he sits in the dock. Everybody who lost their loved ones in Ukraine. The family and friends of Boris Nemtsov, myself included. The family and friends of Alexei Navalny. The family and friends of all the victims of this regime will want to see his face when he sits there like Milosevic sat there at The Hague, that international tribunal. Because that would be too easy if he just dies in office. I'm like you, Mike, I'm a Christian. I know he will get a trial up there anyway, but I also want him to get one here so that people can see it. And the last question, what should the West do to make the most of that window of opportunity? Well, that's a topic I reflected on at the beginning of this conversation. I believe that it's very important that Western countries stand ready to assist that post-Putin transition to democracy in Russia, and to quickly, I stress the word quickly, because that window of opportunity is going to be small, not wait 4 years like people did in the 90s, to very quickly reintegrate that post-Putin democratic Russia back into Europe, back into the civilized world, back into the, what we call the international rules-based order. Because the only way we can have lasting peace, stability, and security on the European continent is with a democratic Russia.
So let me say in closing 2 things. First, you could have just dialed in the Wesson lecture and said 7 minutes of stories, and that would have been just great. But you didn't. You delivered a really deep, thought-provoking, and for me, things I have to think about, big analytic statement, and I want to thank you for that. But I also, even more importantly, I just want to thank you for this incredible conversation we've just had. You were asked some really tough questions, and I appreciate that. Thank you, Stanford, for asking him tough questions. That's what we need to do. But I just want to thank you for your very thoughtful answers, and to remind you, you are always welcome back. It's great to have you back at Stanford, and we look forward to many, many more times.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Mike.